Think about the last time you had a brilliant idea, but chose to do absolutely nothing. You hesitated. You played it safe. You call it being a responsible adult. It is not. It is a psychological scar. For 12 years, the school system deliberately trained you to be terrified of making mistakes. They used red ink to systematically destroy your most powerful financial asset, your self-confidence. They programmed you to be an obedient employee. Today, we tear down that invisible cage and completely dismantle the psychological programming that was designed to keep you poor. You are 35 years old. You step up to your desk and place your hand over the computer mouse. With one click, you finalize the ownership transfer of a commercial real estate project. You do not spend a single cent of your personal capital to complete this transaction. Instead, you secure the entire deal by utilizing a legally binding guarantee contract. In under 3 seconds, the transaction processes, and exactly $100,000 in profit routes directly into your personal bank account. You review the final confirmation displayed on the monitor. Throughout this entire exchange, no physical currency ever moves. No briefcases exchange hands, and no bank vaults open. The money only exists as a digital record, shifting from one corporate ledger to another based entirely on the terms of the agreement you structured. You turn away from the computer and look out the window at the streets below. Down there, millions of people are commuting to their workplaces. They spend their days working for an hourly wage, following strict corporate rules to ensure they do not lose their positions. They trade their time and physical labor to earn paper bills because they believe that money is a concrete, tangible asset. They do not realize the core mechanic of the financial system. Money is not a real object. It is merely an abstract concept that multiplies through agreements, leverage, and applied intelligence. Watching the vehicles move through the intersections, your mind goes back in time. You trace your steps back to when you were exactly 9 years old. That was the specific day you first understood how this system operated, and the exact moment you learned how to create wealth out of thin air. The rain hits the glass of the window pane in a steady rhythm. It is a Tuesday afternoon in the year 1956. You are 9 years old, sitting at a wooden desk in the middle row inside the classroom of Miss Linda. Miss Linda stands at the front of the room. She holds a thick stack of graded mathematics examination papers in her left hand. A red pen rests in her right hand. She begins to call out names one by one. As each name is called, a student stands up, takes their paper, and returns to their seat. Miss Linda calls out the name Oliver. Oliver stands up and walks over to the teacher. Miss Linda hands him his paper. A large grade A is written at the top of his page. Miss Linda holds his paper up for the class to see. She explains that Oliver followed the exact sequence of instructions provided on page 42 of the mathematics textbook. He wrote down each step in the specific order she had demonstrated on the chalkboard. Oliver takes his paper and sits down. Miss Linda continues reading down the list. Eventually, she calls your name. You stand up and walk down the aisle toward the front of the classroom. Miss Linda places your paper face up on the surface of her desk. You look down at the top right corner. There is a grade D written in red ink. The 2 lines of the letter are drawn with heavy pressure. The tip of the pen has torn through the top layer of the paper, leaving a small hole where the 2 red lines cross. You look at the calculations below the grade. Your final answer is completely correct. It is the exact same number Oliver had written on his paper. However, the space above the answer does not contain the sequence of steps from page 42. You had looked at the problem, grouped the numbers differently, and skipped the intermediate steps to arrive directly at the correct solution. Miss Linda points her red pen at the empty space on your page. She looks directly at you. Leo, she says, you cannot create your own rules. Your reckless creativity only brings risk. You pick up the torn paper from the desk, return to your seat, and place it safely inside your notebook. The school day finally ends, and you walk all the way home in the falling rain. The streets are gray, and the sidewalks are covered in deep puddles. You step carefully to keep your shoes completely dry. That evening, you sit at the dining table. The front door opens, and your father, Mr. Mark, walks inside the house. He works a long shift every single day, and his movements are very slow. His broad shoulders slope forward as he walks into the kitchen and sits down in the wooden chair directly across from you. He asks to see your mathematics examination. You open your notebook and slide the torn paper across the table. Mr. Mark looks at the red grade D. He slowly runs his thumb over the small tear in the paper. He looks at the correct final answer, then looks at the blank space where the textbook steps were supposed to be. He does not raise his voice to shout at you. He leans forward and rests his elbows on the table. He lets out a long, quiet breath. There is no place for mistakes in this world, son, he says. Learn to play it safe. He pushes the paper back across the table. You carefully fold it in half and take it to your bedroom. Mr. Mark simply continues his evening routine, a man just providing for his family by following the strict rules he knows. You sit silently on the edge of your bed. You think about the grade A Oliver received and the grade D you received. The sequence of events forms a clear pattern in your developing mind. You begin to believe that doing things differently leads to severe penalties. You decide that trying new methods causes trouble. The idea takes deep root that playing it safe and following established instructions is the only way to survive. You pack your bag for the next day, making a silent promise to memorize the textbook entirely. You walk the remaining distance to the house of your best friend, Mike. The rain has finally stopped, but the dampness lingers heavily in the air, mirroring the sinking feeling in your chest. You carry the torn mathematics paper inside your bag like a physical weight. Your mind still echoes with the resigned voice of your father. You reach the imposing front door of Mike's home and step inside. You bypass the main living room entirely and head straight down the corridor toward the back study. This is the exclusive domain of Mr. Julian. You push the heavy wooden door open and step inside. The room smells strongly of aged leather and rich cigars. Mr. Julian is sitting behind his massive oak desk. His feet are propped up casually on the polished surface. In his right hand, he holds a thick stack of manila files. You step further into the quiet room, your wet shoes making absolutely no sound on the thick carpet. Mr. Julian lowers the files slightly and looks at you over the top rim of his reading glasses. He notices your disheartened, defeated expression almost immediately. You stand before his grand desk, pull out the torn mathematics paper, and lay it flat onto the polished wood. You tell him that Miss Linda gave you a grade D for finding your own unique solution instead of following the textbook steps, and that your father warned you to always play it safe. You ask Mr. Julian why students like Oliver, who obediently follow every single rule, are always praised and rewarded with brand new, boxed toys, while you are punished for thinking differently. You ask him how someone who does not fit into the school's rigid mold can ever hope to make real money or succeed in the real world. Mr. Julian does not offer an answer immediately. Instead, a deep, husky chuckle rumbles in his chest. He swings his feet off the desk and leans forward, dropping the stack of files onto the wooden surface with a heavy thud. He taps his index finger firmly against the top folder. "Do you know what this is, Leo?" he asks. You shake your head silently. "It is a dilapidated, bankrupt lumber mill located on the edge of town," he explains. He leans back in his dark leather chair. "The father of your classmate Oliver is a successful man by conventional standards. When he earns his monthly salary, he takes his money directly to the local bank. He buys a safe savings plan, or perhaps a pre-packaged mutual fund. He hands his hard-earned money over to an institution and hopes they do a good job. That is the mindset of the poor and the middle class. They buy the complete investment package right off the shelf, just like buying a pre-assembled television set. It is easy, it requires absolutely no critical thought, and it feels completely safe." Mr. Julian picks up the manila file once again. "But that is definitely not what I do," he continues, his voice growing sharper and significantly more intense. "I never buy anything that is already perfectly put together. I actively look for the wreckage. I look for the complicated deals that everyone else walks past because they seem too messy or too broken. This bankrupt lumber mill is an absolute disaster to the bank managers. But to me, it is merely a disorganized collection of valuable pieces. I buy the financial wreckage for literal pennies. Then, I find a separate manufacturing company that desperately needs empty warehouse space. I lease the land directly to them, sell off the remaining timber inventory, and completely restructure the existing debt. I do not buy the neat package. I assemble the opportunity from the discarded, unwanted pieces. And by putting those fragmented pieces together, I make money entirely out of thin air." He sets the file down slowly and leans across the wide desk, closing the physical distance between you. His sharp, calculating eyes lock directly onto yours, commanding your absolute, undivided attention. "Listen to me very carefully," he says, his tone lowering into a serious, undeniable truth. "Money is not real, Leo. It is just an agreed-upon societal illusion. I'm any learning in. The only thing in this room that is truly real is your fear. Your fear of making a mistake. Your fear of stepping outside the established, safe lines. If you truly want to rise above the predictable life of a laborer, you must completely stop looking for a guaranteed paycheck. You must stop looking for money." He points a steady finger toward the glass window. "Look for the broken pieces that all the others carelessly throw away, because the person who knows exactly how to put those pieces together is the person who controls the illusion." You leave the heavy, cigar-scented study of Mr. Julian, but his resonant words echo relentlessly inside your 9-year-old mind for days. He did not instruct you to study harder. He did not tell you to seek a higher hourly wage. Instead, he told you to look for the broken pieces that everyone else throws away. Over the next few weeks, as you walk down the familiar concrete sidewalks of your neighborhood, the surrounding world suddenly looks fundamentally different. You are no longer looking at the neatly packaged items displayed beautifully in the bright storefront windows. You are actively scanning the forgotten corners and the neglected narrow alleyways. One late Tuesday afternoon, you and Mike approach the local grocery store owned by Mr. David. Usually, the rear loading area of the storefront is completely quiet. But today, a loud, continuous string of frustrated curses drifts out from the narrow alleyway behind the brick building. You motion for Mike to follow quietly, and the two of you carefully peer around the damp brick corner to observe the commotion. Mr. David is standing dead center in his small, enclosed backyard. He is a heavily built man, and today he is sweating profusely despite the cool air. His white uniform shirt is stained with dark grease and soaked completely through with heavy perspiration. He kicks an empty wooden produce crate across the concrete in absolute frustration, muttering angrily to himself. The source of his immense anger is entirely obvious. The entire back lot is completely overrun with a massive, highly disorganized pile of industrial and commercial waste. There are hundreds of old, unwashed glass bottles stacked precariously against the peeling brick wall. Tangled, heavy spools of rusty copper wire lie abandoned in the muddy dirt, mixed haphazardly together with shattered wooden shipping pallets, thousands of discarded aluminum bottle caps, and the heavy, grease-stained, cast-iron parts of several broken water pumps. Mr. David aggressively wipes his wet forehead with a dirty rag and continues to complain bitterly to his young assistant, who stands nervously by the open back door. You listen intently to his furious rant. Mr. David looks at the towering pile of metal and glass and sees nothing but a massive, space-consuming burden. He complains loudly that the useless garbage is taking up highly valuable storage space that he desperately needs for his upcoming morning produce deliveries. Furthermore, he explicitly views the pile as an active, unavoidable financial drain. You hear him loudly calculate the exact cost of hiring a private sanitation truck and paying the wages of 2 laborers just to haul the heavy mess away to the municipal city dump. To his tired, overworked eyes, those broken pump parts and tangled metallic wires are a severe liability. They are a stressful problem that will inevitably cost him a significant portion of his hard-earned weekly profit to solve. He is staring directly at a pile of physical material, but his vision is entirely clouded by the sheer physical inconvenience of the situation. You stand perfectly still behind the brick wall. Your heart begins to beat at a steadily faster pace. Just a few weeks prior, Mr. Julian had taken you and Mike on a brief educational trip to the large, noisy suburban junkyard located on the far outskirts of the city. You vividly remember the massive industrial scales weighing tons of scrap. You remember watching the junkyard operators hand over crisp paper bills in exchange for raw, unrefined materials. Mr. Julian had carefully explained the fundamental economic law of supply and demand to you that very day. Industrial manufacturing plants constantly need raw metal to melt down and repurpose, and they are always willing to pay good cash for a steady supply. You look back at the chaotic pile in Mr. David's yard. The thick layers of rust, dirt, and grime suddenly fade away from your vision. You mentally separate the tangled mess into distinct categories. You calculate the volume of the heavy copper wire. You estimate the gross weight of the thick aluminum caps and the dense iron pump parts. If carefully separated, cleaned, and transported directly to that specific suburban junkyard, that exact pile of neglected waste could easily fetch at least $15. In the year 1956, $15 is an absolute fortune for a 9-year-old child. It represents more raw capital than you could possibly save in 6 entire months of doing neighborhood chores. Mr. David's exhausted eyes only see worthless trash that will inevitably cost him hard-earned money to remove. Your newly awakened brain, however, sees pure, unadulterated dollars sitting quietly in the mud. You realize, in that profound moment of clarity, exactly what it means to possess financial vision. You understand how to see the lucrative opportunities that the naked eye completely misses. One person's expensive trash has just become your potential property. You stand perfectly still at the edge of the alleyway, the realization of the scrap metal's true financial value pulsing rapidly through your developing mind. However, that initial rush of immense excitement violently crashes into an unforgiving wall of logistical reality. The disorganized pile of copper wire, glass bottles, and heavy iron pump parts is absolutely massive. The suburban scrapyard is located exactly 3 miles away across town. You do not possess a single penny to hire a transport truck, nor do you hold a valid driver's license. Your physical strength is severely limited. You are merely a skinny 9-year-old boy with narrow shoulders and thin arms. Carrying hundreds of pounds of industrial waste down the main road by yourself is a biological impossibility. This precise moment is the exact threshold where the vast majority of fully grown adults completely surrender. When faced with a lucrative opportunity that requires resources they do not currently hold in their hands, ordinary people utter 5 fatal words: "I do not have money." That one sentence acts as a heavy iron gate, slamming shut and effectively terminating any further creative problem-solving or financial thinking. As you stare at the overwhelming pile of debris, the deeply programmed fear heavily resurfaces. The harsh, reprimanding voice of Miss Linda echoes loudly in your ears. You vividly remember the violent sound of her red pen tearing through your mathematics examination paper, leaving that devastating grade D. You remember her sharp, terrifying warning that creating your own rules outside traditional boundaries only brings catastrophic risk. You hear the exhausted, defeated voice of your father, Mr. Mark, pleading with you to simply play it safe and avoid any bold mistakes. Paralyzing anxiety grips your small chest. You instinctively take a step backward, fully prepared to abandon the entire idea, turn around, and walk safely back into the predictable world of obedient schoolchildren. But as the sole of your shoe scrapes against the damp concrete, you freeze. You look over at Mike, who is watching you closely in the silence. Then, you remember the thick scent of cigars and the commanding voice of Mr. Julian. He had looked you straight in the eyes and declared that money is an illusion and that only your fear is truly real. You suddenly understand that if you walk away from this chaotic pile of trash today, you will spend the remaining decades of your life taking orders, shrinking away from challenges, and living in perpetual fear of failure. You clench your small hands into tight fists, actively pushing the manufactured terror down into the absolute pit of your stomach. You force your feet to move forward. You step completely out from the safe shadows of the brick wall and walk directly into the open yard toward the visibly frustrated grocery store manager. Mr. David pauses his angry ranting and stares down at you, his face flushed and his expression deeply irritated by the sudden interruption. He towers over you, an intimidating mountain of sweat and stained fabric. You do not ask him for money. You do not ask for a charitable handout. You recognize that successful business is fundamentally about identifying and solving problems, and Mr. David currently has a massive problem taking up his valuable commercial space. "Mr. David," you say, forcing your voice to remain completely steady and clear despite the frantic, nervous trembling in your chest. "If I clean up this entire yard for you on Saturday afternoon, will you let me have this pile of rubbish?" The large man stops wiping his wet forehead. He squints, looking down at your incredibly thin frame and your clean school clothes. A cynical, highly doubtful smirk slowly spreads across his wide face. He sees nothing but a weak, naive 9-year-old child making a physically impossible promise. However, his calculating mind also instantly recognizes the distinct possibility of acquiring completely free labor. He has absolutely zero financial risk in agreeing to your terms. He leans forward slightly, his broad shadow falling heavily over you. "If you clean it up completely before the sun sets on Saturday, it is all yours," he says, nodding his head one single time. "Otherwise, do not ever hang around here again." You nod firmly, sealing the verbal agreement. As you turn and walk away from the grocery store, the profound magnitude of what just occurred washes over your mind. You have just successfully closed your very first business transaction. You secured total, legal control over an asset without spending a single penny of your personal capital. You did not submit an application to a bank, and you did not beg your parents for a loan. You completely bypassed the traditional financial system. By intelligently leveraging the art of negotiation and offering a direct solution to another man's problem, you successfully generated capital entirely out of thin air. You have the verbal agreement with the grocery store manager. The discarded scrap metal is now officially yours to claim. However, the physical reality of the situation remains completely unchanged. The suburban junkyard is located exactly 3 miles away. The thick copper wire and heavy iron pump parts weigh hundreds of pounds. You cannot possibly carry them. You do not possess a transport truck. You do not have the physical strength. If you were a conventional thinker, you would surrender right here. You would conclude that because you personally lack the physical resources, the business deal is effectively dead. But the lesson from the cigar room dictates your next move. You realize that you do not need to possess the physical strength yourself, you only need to know how to control it. You think of your older brother, Nick. Nick is several years older than you. He and his regular group of teenage friends are big, strong, and highly energetic. They spend their free afternoons lifting weights and constructing large wooden pushcarts to race down the steep neighborhood hills. They possess the exact physical infrastructure and muscle power that you currently lack. However, they share one massive, consistent vulnerability. They are always completely broke. They never have any cash for sodas, movie tickets, or new wheels for their wooden carts. They have an absolute abundance of physical energy, but zero financial intelligence. They are the perfect labor force for your newly acquired asset. You find Nick and his friends hanging around the front yard of your house. You walk directly up to them, masking your nervousness. You do not use complicated business words. You speak the only language teenagers understand: fast cash. You state clearly that you have secured exclusive access to a local yard, currently holding at least $15 worth of heavy metal. You lay out the rules. They will bring their large wooden carts, load up the heavy scrap, and push it the 3 miles across town to the junkyard. When the operator pays out the cash, they will take exactly 50% of the total profit as payment for their physical labor. You and Mike will keep the remaining 50% simply because you own the asset. The older boys look at each other. They do the quick mental mathematics. Earning $7.50 just for pushing a wooden cart is a massive financial windfall for them. They immediately agree to the terms of your deal. The labor force is successfully secured, but another critical problem immediately emerges in your mind. You are only 9 years old. Nick and his friends are much larger, stronger, and highly unpredictable teenagers. Once they reach the junkyard and collect the $15 in cash, there is a very high probability they might try to cheat you. They could easily lie about the total weight of the metal, claim the scrapyard paid a lower rate, and keep a much larger percentage of the money for themselves. You recognize this as a severe operational risk. You need an independent auditor. You immediately think of Lily, a girl in your class who consistently scores perfect grades in mathematics. She is precise, strict, and completely incorruptible. You approach Lily and offer her a professional job. You ask her to accompany the carts to the junkyard, carefully read the industrial scale, and accurately record the final payout in a paper ledger. Her compensation for this auditing job will be exactly 1 large ice cream cone. She accepts the offer without any hesitation. When Saturday afternoon arrives, the operation begins exactly as you planned. You stand quietly in the cool shade of a large tree across the alleyway from the grocery store. You watch intently as Nick and his muscular friends sweat profusely under the bright sun. They are grunting and straining as they heave the heavy, rusted iron pump parts and thick copper wires onto their wooden carts. Lily stands nearby with a notepad and pencil, watching the entire inventory process like a hawk. You observe the scene in complete silence. You are not lifting a single piece of heavy metal. You are not using your muscles, and you are not risking your own physical safety. You are using your brain. You have successfully organized a complete, functioning system. You brought together the physical labor of the strong and the calculating accuracy of the smart, binding them together with a clear financial incentive. You realize that true power does not come from doing the hard labor yourself. True power comes from organizing people who are stronger and smarter than you to execute your vision. The loading process takes over 2 hours to complete. Nick and his 4 friends lift the heavy iron pump parts and the thick coils of copper wire, stacking them high onto the beds of 2 wooden pushcarts. You and Mike walk ahead, leading the group out of the grocery store alleyway. The 3-mile journey to the suburban scrapyard begins. The midday sun beats down on the asphalt. The older boys push the carts from behind, leaning their entire body weight against the wooden frames. The heavy metal cargo presses down hard on the axles. For the first mile, the system operates exactly as you planned. You are a 9-year-old boy, successfully managing a labor force. Then, the group reaches a busy commercial intersection. The traffic light turns green. Nick pushes his cart forward to cross the 2 lanes of moving traffic. Suddenly, a sharp, loud crack splits the air. The right wooden axle of the lead cart snaps completely in 2 under the severe weight. The wooden bed of the cart drops abruptly. The entire structure tilts violently to the right side. The sudden loss of physical balance throws the heavy cargo forward. Hundreds of glass bottles, massive spools of wire, and greasy pump parts crash directly onto the hot asphalt. Glass shatters loudly. Iron scrapes against the road. The cargo scatters widely across the intersection. Vehicles traveling behind the cart slam their brakes. Tires screech against the pavement. A long line of automobiles comes to a complete halt. Drivers press their hands firmly on their steering wheels, honking their horns continuously. The noise fills the entire street. From the corner, a uniformed city policeman blows his silver whistle. He jogs quickly to the center of the mess. He points his baton directly at you and the older boys, shouting strict orders to clear the public roadway immediately. Panic erupts. Nick and his friends stop trying to pick up the spilled metal. They turn around and walk directly toward you. They raise their voices, shouting that this was entirely your idea. They yell that they refuse to take the blame for blocking traffic and littering the intersection. You step backward to get away from them. Your shoe steps on a piece of broken glass. You lose your footing and fall hard onto the asphalt. A sharp piece of rusted metal slices deeply into your right knee. Blood immediately begins to run down your leg. Before you can stand back up, a familiar vehicle pulls up to the edge of the scattered debris. The driver door opens. Mr. Mark steps out into the street. His face is entirely pale. He surveys the stopped cars, the shouting policemen, and the angry teenagers. Then his eyes find you sitting on the ground. He does not argue with the older boys. He does not speak to the angry policeman. He walks straight through the wreckage, grabs you firmly by the upper arm, his grip tight enough to leave a mark, and pulls you up from the asphalt. The absolute public humiliation burns your face. "I told you, Leo," he says, his voice shaking with a mix of absolute frustration and deep embarrassment. "This is exactly why you should not do these things. Do you see the consequences of breaking the rules? Go home immediately. Lock the door and study your books." He turns his back to you and begins lifting the heavy iron parts himself to clear the public road. Your stomach churns violently. You walk away from the intersection. You do not look back at the broken cart or the lost scrap metal. You walk the remaining distance to your house. The cut on your right knee burns with every single step. You walk through the front door, go straight to your bedroom, and sit on the edge of your mattress. You wrap a white bandage around your bleeding knee. You watch the small red stain seep through the cloth. Sitting there, you completely collapse inward. You review the events of the afternoon and conclude that the adults were entirely right. Miss Linda was correct when she crossed out your test. Your father was correct to demand safety. Taking risks brings public humiliation, financial loss, and physical pain. You decide that taking a risk is a fundamental sin. Hours pass. Evening arrives. The door to your bedroom opens, and Mr. Julian steps inside. He walks over and stands looking down at you. He does not offer a sympathetic smile. He does not apologize for the events that occurred on the road. He looks directly at the white bandage wrapped securely around your right knee. When you are learning to ride a bicycle, Mr. Julian says, his voice steady and calm, "You fall off. Your knee hits the concrete. You bleed. When that happens, do you put the bicycle away permanently? Do you lock it in the garage and never touch it again? Or do you get back on the seat and keep riding?" You do not answer him. The game of money operates on the exact same rules. Failure is an inevitable process. If you lose a deal, you do not quit. You go over, you shake hands with your opponent, and you say, "I will see you next week." He points a finger at your injured leg. If you let this scar scare you into quitting, you will forever remain a hired hand. You will spend your entire life working for the people who dare to overcome that exact same fear. Those who fear loss will never win. He turns around and walks out of the bedroom, leaving the door wide open. The very next morning, as the pale sun begins to rise over the quiet neighborhood, you do not lock your bedroom door and study your textbooks as you were fiercely instructed to do. You do not surrender to the crushing humiliation of the previous afternoon. Instead, you walk into the damp garage, borrow a heavy steel hammer and a handful of thick iron nails, and go find your brother, Nick. Together, in the early morning light, the two of you carefully repair the splintered wooden axle of the broken pushcart. It takes hours of frustrating, exhausting labor, but the wheel finally holds. You slowly, meticulously, push the heavy load, the remaining distance to the suburban scrapyard. When the yard operator finally places the crisp paper bills into your dirty, blistered palms, you realize something profoundly transformative. The exact sum of $15 you hold is not an hourly wage. It is not a charitable allowance handed down by a sympathetic authority figure. It is pure capital, generated exclusively by your own financial mindset. It is the direct, tangible reward for possessing the raw courage to overcome a broken wheel, a bleeding knee, and the harsh ridicule of the adults who aggressively demanded that you stop. The vivid memory slowly fades into the quiet shadows, and you are 35 years old once again. You slowly pull your gaze away from the glowing computer screen in your silent, darkened penthouse apartment. We are now living deep within the information age, yet the fundamental rules of the wealth game remain entirely unchanged. The modern world moves at the absolute speed of light, shifting and evolving faster than any traditional curriculum could ever record. Within this constant, chaotic motion, millions of highly lucrative opportunities are scattered across the globe, waiting quietly like invisible junkyards for someone to notice their hidden value. Technical knowledge, reading the ledgers, understanding supply and demand, these are merely the basic analytical tools. True financial competence requires the internal courage to actually pick up those tools and use them when the entire world tells you to step back. You walk over to the floor-to-ceiling glass window and look down at the dark, wet city streets. A hurried crowd of pedestrians is running frantically through the freezing rain, holding briefcases over their heads, rushing to clock into their safe, predictable jobs. They are incredibly intelligent people. They are exceptionally hardworking individuals, but the traditional system deliberately severed their courage from a very young age. They cling desperately to outdated notions of corporate security, holding on to the hollow promise of a steady paycheck like a leaky life raft in a violent, unpredictable ocean. They genuinely believe that avoiding failure is the ultimate goal, not realizing that their absolute ignorance of how money truly operates is the greatest risk they could possibly take. You watch them scatter into the concrete buildings, and you finally understand the tragic irony of their daily existence. They genuinely believe that avoiding failure is the ultimate goal, completely unaware that their absolute ignorance of how money truly operates is the most dangerous risk they could possibly take. You watch them scatter into the concrete buildings, and you finally understand the tragic irony of their existence. The ultimate price of spending your entire life trying to avoid a single scratch on your knee is a life forever imprisoned in a perfectly safe, but completely imaginary, cage.